Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is a place where we slow down, relax, and take a peaceful walk through forgotten history. Tonight, we're stepping into the shoes of a medieval peasant. No kings, no knights, just ordinary people living quiet lives in the Middle Ages. So find a comfy spot, maybe grab a blanket, and let's travel back to a simpler time. This is 25 things from everyday life in the Middle Ages. Have you ever wondered what everyday life was like in the Middle Ages? From the clothes people wore to the tools they used, medieval life was full of fascinating objects that shaped daily routines. This guide explores 25 essential items that a medieval person relied on, covering personal belongings, household necessities, and work-related tools. Whether you're interested in medieval history, daily life, or historical objects, this list will give you a glimpse into how people lived during the Middle Ages, before the days of zippers and even buttons, as they only started to be used in the 13th century. People used brooches to fasten clothing together. Often made of metal, brooches were intricately designed and decorated, resembling jewelry. They came in a variety of shapes and styles, from simple pins to ornate disc brooches adorned with gemstones, enamel, or filigree. Viking-era brooches, for example, were large and often paired, used to fasten cloaks or dresses. In later medieval Europe, brooches also served as status symbols, with the wealthiest individuals commissioning gold or silver pieces inlaid with precious stones. Some brooches even had religious inscriptions or hidden compartments for carrying relics or charms. Grooming and beauty were important to medieval people, and a comb was an essential tool for that. They were usually made of wood or bone, but we have many examples of those made from ivory. Some medieval combs were elaborately carved with intricate patterns, particularly those owned by nobility or religious figures. Double-sided combs were popular, with one side featuring wide teeth for detangling hair, and the other with fine teeth for styling or removing lice. Because hygiene practices varied, combs were also used to keep hair clean and free of pests, especially since frequent bathing was uncommon for most people. In some cultures, combs were even seen as symbolic objects. Viking burials, for example, sometimes included combs, suggesting their importance in daily life and personal care. Both men and women often wore headgear, and there were many varieties and styles. What you wore on your head was a good indication of how wealthy or important you were. Jeffrey Singman writes, "Ordinary women of the period are often shown wearing a simple wrap, probably consisting only of a long rectangle of fabric, either tucked into itself or secured in place with a band wrapped twice around the head." Noble women could have elaborate headdresses, such as the henina tall, conical hat often seen in medieval artwork. Men also wore a variety of hats, ranging from simple woolen caps to the more refined chaperon, which featured a distinctive draped or turban-like appearance. A small knife was a common everyday item in the Middle Ages, used both as an eating utensil and as a tool. They were typically carried on a person's belt, making them easily accessible for a variety of tasks, from cutting food to whittling wood or even Unlike today's table settings, medieval people did not have forks as standard utensils, so knives were used for most cutting and eating tasks. The wealthy might have ornately decorated knives with engraved handles made of bone, ivory, or silver. While common folk used simpler iron or steel blades, some knives were small and practical, while others, such as the miséricorde, were designed for more specific purposes, including delivering a mercy stroke to fallen knights on the battlefield. Shoes came in many shapes and styles and could be made of cloth, leather, or even wood clogs. Towards the later Middle Ages, one style of shoe popular with men featured very long pointed tips. Apparently, they were painful to wear, as they could cause bunions, known as poulines. These exaggerated pointed shoes were a fashion statement among the wealthy, with the length of the toe sometimes restricted by law to prevent excessive extravagance. More practical footwear included simple ankle boots, turn shoes, soft leather shoes sewn inside out and then flipped, and wooden pattens, which were strapped over shoes to keep feet dry in muddy or wet conditions. Peasants typically wore sturdy, practical leather shoes or went barefoot, while nobles often had their shoes dyed and embroidered as a sign of status. Medieval beds were not as soft as modern ones. They had a wooden frame and a few layers of mattresses. One on the bottom was stuffed with straw, the next one filled with wool, and others with slightly better material like goose feathers. The wealthiest individuals sometimes had elaborate canopy beds with heavy curtains, which provided warmth and privacy in drafty stone buildings. Peasants, on the other hand, often slept on simple straw pallets or wooden benches. In some households, multiple family members or servants shared a bed, as sleeping arrangements were dictated by both space and social status. If you needed light when indoors or at night, you would probably use a candle. During the Middle Ages, there were two kinds of candles: tallow, made from sheep fat, and wax, made from beeswax. Wax candles were more expensive because they burned more cleanly and did not produce as much smoke or odor. In wealthier households, beeswax candles were used in religious ceremonies or placed in elaborate chandeliers to illuminate grand halls. Tallow candles, on the other hand, were common in everyday homes but produced a smoky, unpleasant smell when burned. Because candles were costly, many medieval people relied on rushlight strips of plant stalks dipped in animal fat as a cheaper alternative. Like today, medieval chairs came in all shapes and sizes. Some were simple stools or benches, while those used as thrones were much more ornate, often with a high back. Large, carved wooden chairs with armrests and decorative elements were often reserved for nobles or higher-ranking officials, emphasizing their authority. The majority of people, however, sat on wooden benches, chests, or even the floor. One unique type of medieval chair was the faldstool, a folding seat used by traveling clergy or officials, which allowed them to sit comfortably while on the move. In wealthier homes, chairs were sometimes cushioned with wool-stuffed fabrics for extra comfort. If you needed to go to the washroom but didn't want to leave your bedroom, a medieval person would likely use a chamber pot, often made from metal or ceramics. These pots were commonly placed under beds or inside wooden furniture, designed to discreetly store them. Wealthier households sometimes had chamber pots decorated with engravings or painted designs, while those in castles or monasteries might use stone or light-lined versions. Chamber pots were emptied into cesspits or thrown into the streets in many medieval towns, contributing to the widespread issue of sanitation and unpleasant smells in urban areas. In larger residences, dedicated servants were responsible for disposing of waste, while monasteries and castles often had garderobe stone latrines built over running water for better hygiene, for heat and cooking. You would often have an ongoing fire called a hearth. They were usually found in the middle of the room, which was the best way to make use of all of its heat. The smoke was supposed to go up through a hole in the roof, but often a medieval room had a smoky smell. Over time, fireplaces evolved to be built into walls with chimneys, which significantly improved ventilation and made homes more comfortable. In castles and wealthier homes, large stone fireplaces were often elaborately decorated with carved mantels and family crests. In monasteries, great halls, and kitchens, enormous hearths allowed for cooking multiple meals at once, with metal hooks and spits used for roasting meat. Despite these advancements, many medieval homes remained smoky and cold, with firewood being a valuable and sometimes scarce resource. You always need containers for storing food or other goods. And pottery was a big business throughout the medieval world. Much of the surviving art from the Middle Ages is found on pottery, including jars, pitchers, and decanters. Everyday jars were often made from earthenware or stoneware, while wealthier households had glazed ceramics that were more decorative and durable. These vessels stored everything from grain and dried herbs to liquids like oil, wine, and honey. In some regions, potters developed highly distinctive styles, such as the green-glazed pottery of England or the intricate blue and white ceramics of the Islamic world. The production and trade of pottery were essential parts of medieval economies, with specialized workshops and guilds controlling the craft. In many towns and cities, to help lock a door or chest, you would need a key made of metal. They were often much larger than modern keys. Keys and locks were particularly important for securing valuables, especially in castles, monasteries, and merchant homes. The most common type of medieval lock was a warded lock, which relied on internal obstructions wards that could only be bypassed with a key of the correct shape. Wealthier individuals often carried ornate keys as a symbol of authority. Castle gatekeepers, church officials, and high-ranking servants had keys that signified their control over important spaces. Some keys were small enough to be worn as pendants or hidden in clothing, while others, such as those for city gates or treasuries, were massive and required great effort to turn. The most common type of table in the Middle Ages was a trestle. They came in pieces that you would have to set up with 2 or 3 supports and then lay a flat board across them. This design made them easy to dismantle and move, which was especially useful in castles and great halls where space needed to be rearranged for feasts, meetings, or other activities. In noble households and monasteries, tables were often long and narrow, allowing large groups to dine together with the most important people seated at the head. The wealthy sometimes had ornately carved wooden tables, while peasants typically used simple wooden planks supported by logs or crates. In some places, stone tables were used in kitchens and workrooms due to their durability and resistance to fire. In the Middle Ages, food was often served on another piece of food. A trencher was usually an old slice of bread, round in shape, on which other food was placed. Once the meal was finished, the trencher might be soaked in sauce, and sometimes it was given to the poor. Trenchers were common in both noble and peasant Households, though wealthier individuals, often used fine white bread, while poorer families relied on coarse, dark bread. By the late Middle Ages, wooden trenchers began to replace bread ones, particularly in wealthier homes where tableware became more refined. Some noble households had trenchers made of metal or ceramic, used repeatedly rather than consumed. The practice of using bread trenchers eventually declined as plates became more common, but they remained a practical way to serve food during large medieval feasts. While only wealthy people had their own washtubs, public bathhouses were common in many cities for general use. Made of wood and circular shaped, a medieval washtub could be large enough for 2 or more people to sit in while water was brought to them. Bathing was often a social activity, especially in cities where bathhouses provided a place not just for cleanliness but also for relaxation and even business discussions. Wealthy households sometimes had wooden tubs lined with metal or ceramic to retain heat longer, and servants would heat water over a fire before filling the tub. However, for most peasants, full baths were infrequent due to the labor-intensive process of hauling and heating water. Instead, they would often wash using basins, cloths, and herbal soaps. One of the instruments typically used by blacksmiths, anvils, are heavy blocks of metal. When working with iron or other metals, the blacksmith would place the material on an anvil and use a hammer to shape it, creating items such as armor, weapons, or tools. Anvils were often made of iron or steel and designed with different surfaces for various tasks. Some had a flat top for general shaping, while others featured a horn for bending metal. Skilled blacksmiths could use anvils to craft intricate designs, from delicate filigree work to durable horseshoes and swords. Most medieval people did not have books. Those that did included priests and monks, the nobility, and other wealthy individuals. In the Middle East and China, where printing was invented, books were more widely used. Within medieval Europe, books were typically created using animal skins that could be turned into vellum, which was then sewn together into leather bindings. The process of making a single book was labor-intensive, often requiring months or even years of meticulous work by scribes and illuminators. Some books contained elaborate hand-painted illustrations, known as illuminations, which depicted religious stories, historical events, or even daily life. There were many kinds of musical instruments in the Middle Ages. Some of the most popular included the lute, a string instrument similar to a guitar, and the horn, often made from an animal horn, flutes, recorders, and pipe. Organs were also used during this period. Music played an essential role in both religious and secular life, with minstrels and troubadours performing in courts and marketplaces. Other common instruments included the viol, a bowed string instrument similar to a modern violin, and the hurdy-gurdy, which used a crank to produce continuous sound. Drums and bells were widely used, especially in military and religious settings, signaling anything from battle formations to church services. Nobility often hired musicians to entertain guests, while peasants enjoyed music during festivals and communal gatherings. One of the most important tasks on a medieval farm was breaking the soil so it could be planted with crops. To do so, you would need a plower type of blade that could be dragged through the ground, slicing it up as it moved, typically pulled by animals. Heavier plows were needed to break up tougher soils, such as those in northern Europe. The Moldboard plow, introduced in the early Middle Ages, was a game changer, as it turned over the soil more effectively, making farming more productive. Peasants often shared plows within their village, as they were expensive to produce. Oxen were the most common draft animals used for plowing, although in wealthier regions, horses were sometimes preferred due to their speed. To properly measure the weight of something, medieval people used a scale. For example, a merchant would need to accurately weigh goods, and medieval governments often had many regulations for their use. The most common type was the balance scale, which consisted of a beam with two hanging pans. An item was placed in one pan, and counterweights or standard weights in the other to determine its mass. Scales were essential in trade, especially in bustling markets where goods such as grain, spices, wool, and precious metals were bought and sold. In some towns, officials known as waymasters ensured merchants used fair and standardized measurements to prevent fraud. Larger trade hubs often had public weighing stations, where disputes over weight and pricing could be settled under local law. A medieval soldier often carried a shield. Some styles included the circular wooden shield, often associated with Vikings, and the pavus, which was large enough to cover an entire body, allowing an archer or crossbowman to crouch behind it while preparing their attacks. Shields were typically made of wood, reinforced with leather, and sometimes edged or covered with metal for extra durability. The kite shield, popular in the 11th and 12th centuries, provided excellent leg protection for cavalry, while the heater shield, which emerged later, was more compact and favored by knights. Many shields bore coats of arms or personal insignia, allowing warriors to be identified on the battlefield. During sieges, larger wooden shields or mantlets were used as mobile cover for advancing troops, demonstrating the shield's vital role beyond individual combat. Working as a farmer in the Middle Ages meant using a few different tools, including the shovel. They have been used since ancient times, and they are very similar to those you can buy today. Medieval shovels were typically made of wood with an iron-reinforced edge to help with digging in tougher soils. They were essential for agriculture, helping with planting, irrigation, and moving soil or compost. Shovels were also widely used in construction, particularly for digging foundations and trenches. In the process of making clothing, you would need to take wool, flax, or cotton and turn it into yarn. Spindles were handheld tools that, through twisting and turning, helped collect yarn before the spinning wheel became widespread in the later Middle Ages. The drop spindle was the primary tool used for spinning thread. These simple but effective tools consisted of a wooden rod, the spindle with a weighted whirl at one end, to maintain momentum. One of the most important weapons of the Middle Ages. The sword is essentially a long piece of iron that has been sharpened. They can be found throughout the medieval world, coming in many different sizes and styles. Early medieval swords, such as those used by Vikings, were often broad-bladed and designed for slashing. Swords were not just weapons, but also symbols of status and chivalry. They were often richly decorated with inscriptions, engravings, and elaborate pommels. Knights would swear oaths upon their swords, and some blades were believed to have mystical or religious significance. Many professions in the Middle Ages required a variety of tools. Everyday items like saws, hammers, and chisels were needed for construction or crafting. Blacksmiths used tongs and anvils to shape metal. Carpenters relied on planes and augers for woodworking, and masons had chisels and mallets for cutting stone. Farmers used hoes, scythes, and sickles to cultivate crops, while leatherworkers employed knives and awls to make shoes, belts, and saddles. Everyday life in the Middle Ages was shaped by the tools, clothing, and objects people used daily. While some of these medieval items have evolved into modern versions, others have disappeared entirely. Understanding these items gives us a unique glimpse into how medieval people lived, worked, and adapted to their world.